There are a ton of great Vita games out there. Too many to name, and just not enough space on this list to include them all. There are, however, games I've noticed that people don't often talk about. Now, I've heard about these games mentioned here and there in small circles, but for the most part, they rarely ever get noticed. Here's my top 10 PS Vita games that no one ever talks about. As always, if you like the video, maybe subscribe. Number 10. Entwine. A rhythm-based game where you guide two souls through the course of many lifetimes. Each analog stick is represented by a different soul. The left stick controls the fish, and the right stick controls the bird. At first, I wasn't sure what to make of this game, and to be honest, I wasn't sure what I was even looking at. You guide each soul through a series of patterns, and when you reach a certain amount, the two souls join to relive a memory from a previous life. At least that's what I got from it. The gameplay is pretty simple and straightforward. Making a perfect rotation with the joystick is so satisfying for some reason. The game is pretty to look at, even if I wasn't sure what I was looking at half the time. My only complaint is that the controls might be a little touchy, especially on the later levels. Some rotations require the steady hand of a surgeon, which might take some practice. Number 9. MURASAKI Baby. A side-scrolling puzzle platformer that's controlled completely using the front and back touchscreen. You basically have to guide a little girl known as Baby through each level by dragging her along, at the same time having to make sure the balloon she's carrying doesn't pop. The neat little gimmick here is that by swiping the back touchscreen, you can change the look of the background. Not only for aesthetics, but different backdrops allow for different mechanics to be used. For example, once you've selected your backdrop, tapping the back touch will trigger an event, causing a change in the scenery, helping you to progress further through the stage. Although the controls don't always respond the way you want them to, they're simple enough where most levels can be figured out through trial and error. Visually, it's one of the most bizarre and interesting looking games I've ever played. It's like something straight out of a Tim Burton film. The sound design is also weird, but in a good way. A lot of the noises coming from the background remind me of those old black and white TV shows about outer space for some reason. For something strange and out of the ordinary, MURASAKI Baby is definitely the game to go with. Number 8. Super Time Force Ultra. Played like your traditional side-scrolling action shooter game, except with an interesting wrinkle thrown into the mix. You're given the ability to time travel. It works by allowing you to rewind back to the exact moment of your death and basically create a clone of yourself, or another teammate of your choosing. Each clone before that still retains the exact movement and action that was made up until their demise. It's a little hard to explain until you play it yourself, but seeing the game in action is pretty remarkable. Clever writing and cool retro graphics also keep the game entertaining throughout. Fans looking for classic run and gun action, but with a little more depth, should definitely check out Super Time Force Ultra. Number 7. Resogun. Not quite as visually stunning as its PS4 counterpart, Resogun on the Vita still retains all the gameplay elements that made it great in the first place. As a spiritual successor to the Super Stardust HD games, Resogun draws many inspirations from past arcade shoot-'em-ups. The game consists of 5 levels, each separated into 3 phases. Your goal is to get the highest score possible by eliminating all enemies on the screen. Saving humans can also be used to increase your score bonus. Resogun is light on story, but heavy on gameplay. It's perfect for those pick up and play moments where you only have a few minutes to burn. Number 6. Limbo. It's very atmospheric to say the least. The game is presented in black and white tones, overlaid with a film grain effect. There's brilliant use of light and shadow. It's eerie and spooky, but strangely calming at the same time. Even though there's hardly any color in the game, I found it quite easy to discern what the objects were within the environment. At first glance, you could write it off as a children's puzzle platformer, but it's actually quite dark, and dare I say, gruesome? You progress through the level by solving environmental puzzles. The thing I find appealing here is that it's not always easy to recognize the solution. Sometimes you really have to study your surroundings. Objects and switches are cleverly placed, giving you an immense feeling of satisfaction upon solving each puzzle. Number 5. The Unfinished SWAN. If there ever was an argument that video games couldn't be considered art, then bring up this game. The Unfinished Swan is a first-person adventure game where your goal is to track down a swan that has escaped from a painting. You start your adventure with a blank white canvas and have to find your way by throwing black paint onto the screen. Very artsy to say the least. The concept was cool at first, but I got a little worried when I assumed this is what the entire game was going to be about. Fortunately for me, it wasn't. As you progress further, more color is added to the environment and new mechanics are given to you. For example, trading in your black paint for water, which you can use to speed up the growth of vines so you can climb walls. I couldn't help but be reminded of Mirror's Edge for some reason. Maybe because of its linear structure and primary colors. The game is relaxing, with calming visuals and a peaceful soundtrack. Take your time. This isn't a game that needs to be rushed through. Clocking in at around 2 hours, The Unfinished Swan can be completed in a single afternoon. It may be short, but it's an adventure worth playing and a story worth listening to. Number 4. Hotline Miami. A top-down 8-bit retro-inspired action stealth game with a legendary soundtrack to back it up. Hotline Miami is a blend of GTA, Scarface, and Pulp Fiction. Add in any other similarities I might have forgotten. The thing that sets Hotline Miami apart from other indie games is not so much its gameplay, but how it blends the visuals, sound, and presentation to create an unforgettable story. It's quite an outer body experience. That's not to say the gameplay is any slouch either. Extremely fast and highly addictive. Having a plan of attack is recommended, with an ability to adapt to any given situation is a must. The move to the PS Vita may take some getting used to, since the right analog stick doesn't provide the precise aiming offered from a keyboard and mouse. Still, given its portability, it's one of the best games to play on the go and on the can. Number 3. Velocity 2X. This game doesn't get enough credit. And I'm ashamed to say this, but I feel I didn't do it enough justice in my previous review. Velocity 2X is another arcade-inspired shoot-'em-up, except this time, it's mixed in with a few levels of quick side-scrolling platforming. Jumping back and forth between the two different gameplay elements doesn't come off as jarring at all. In fact, they complement each other quite well. The vertical shoot-'em-up segments are fast, loud, and explosive. The same can be said about the side-scrolling platforming sections too. With a heavy emphasis on speed, you'll find yourself teledashing through enemies in no time. And the soundtrack definitely has to be mentioned. Reminds me of Mega Man, reminds me of staring into the future where robots have taken over, reminds me of awesome 80s kung fu movies. It is all those things and more. Number 2. MACHINARIUM. I think that's how you pronounce it. Wow, this game takes me back. It was one of the first games I played on my PS Vita. Check out the review if you ever have a chance. At the time, I remember really enjoying it. I went back again to see if I felt the same way, and yep, it's still one of my favorite games. MACHINARIUM is a puzzle point-and-click adventure game. It's one of those really slow games where you sort of just take your time and appreciate the artwork on display. The music is also a major highlight. It has this soothing, new age, almost techno sound to it. I think the reason why I like this game so much is because the world that's presented to you is so believable. There's no crazy explosions, no quick camera cuts, just simple but beautiful hand-drawn artwork. There is just so much detail on the screen at all times. I don't think there was one scene in the entire game that I thought wasn't interesting. Clever use of thought bubbles also help to illustrate key objectives. The game can be challenging since you're not always sure what you have to do, but thanks to a 2-tier hint system, you're never completely lost. MACHINARIUM does a wonderful job of creating a captivating story with point-and-click gameplay. Although this game is offered on multiple platforms, you can't deny how amazing the 2D artwork looks on the OLED Vita display. Number 1. Flower. Well, I guess you guys didn't see this one coming. You play as the wind, flying and soaring through the skies, picking up flower petals along the way. You start at one end of the field and finish at the other. I first played Flower on the PS3 back in 2009, then again when it was released on the PS4. When I heard it was being ported to the PS Vita, I was a bit wary. The game looked gorgeous on the consoles, but I wasn't sure how that would translate over to a portable handheld. Aside from a few rough graphical edges and a new motion control touch scheme, the move to the PS Vita turned out pretty well. I can't exactly pinpoint why I love this game so much. I tell people this is one of my favorite games of all time, but they look at me and laugh. They tell me there's nothing to do in this game, but I tell them that's not the point. It's not what you do, it's how it makes you feel. Flower is one of the most peaceful and relaxing games I've ever experienced. Here's an example some of my anime fans might understand. You guys ever notice while watching an anime, they often use a lot of establishing shots? Like, for example, maybe a giant empty field, or a shot overlooking the city at night with the lights shining from each individual apartment complex. Or perhaps even as the sun is about to set and you get that orange and purple hue slowly fading on the horizon. Well, that's what this game reminds me of. Those brief moments of tranquility that is portrayed so well in anime. Except here, the entire game is made of it. It's a feeling I can't quite put into words other than the explanation I just gave. Only certain games have the ability to evoke that kind of emotion. And when it does, I know there's something special. Flower is one of those games. Alright guys, some of these games might be a little different than what you're normally used to, but trust me, if you just venture out of the box every once in a while, you'll realize there are other great games out there.